Inscribed upon the ruins of the Temple of Apollo in Delphi, home to the Foreseer's oracle, is a simple directive: know thyself. Greece, being the home of Western philosophy, is also the origin of a related phrase: the unexamined life is not worth living. In the East, yogis and monks were developing meditation and its most basic principle, that awareness precedes control. There are a lot of definitions for a life well lived, but they all rest on the same foundation: awareness. Part 1. Philosophy. Stoicism is a philosophy experiencing a bit of a resurgence in the modern day, likely in response to a rising sense of powerlessness, but let's hear what they actually have to say about a life well lived. The basic foundation of Stoicism is that capital M man is rational and social. Rational in the sense that he can examine his own thinking, and social in the sense that cooperation comes naturally if you truly understand the world. Stoicism encourages the critical examination of emotions, and John Sellers, who is the chair of modern Stoicism, puts it like this in his book Lessons in Stoicism: our emotions are the product of judgments we make. Consequently, we are in control of our emotions and responsible for them. He goes on to say this about virtue, which is the key to a life well lived in the Stoic model. The first step toward virtue is to start to pay attention to the condition of our souls, just as Socrates exhorted, which is to say, our beliefs, judgments, and values. This focus on self-awareness is something that I think is missing in the pop culture image of Stoicism, which cares far too much for the toughing it out and emotional resilience that just scratch the surface of what Stoicism actually means. The Stoics are advocates for intentional living. As Massimo Pigliucci puts it in his book How to Be a Stoic, we need to develop a life plan. To do this, we must take a look at our entire life, make plans, and arrive at decisions, all things considered, as philosophers say. Make a habit of reflecting on what is important and on the best way to achieve it, and also continuously revise our life plan according to our changing abilities and circumstances. Our dynamic plan should be coherent, revisable, and ideally, compatible with a generally rising level of life satisfaction. To this end, the Stoics have a journaling practice where, before sleeping, you recount the day as objectively as you can and audit what happened with the goal of asking, what bad habit of yours have you cured today? What vice have you checked? In what respect are you better? As Pigliucci puts it. The ultimate goal of Stoicism is virtue, and virtue can only be achieved through awareness and reason. This is something that it shares with our other philosophy of note today. Full disclosure, Buddhism and the yogic traditions that it's a part of are technically religions and spiritualities, and that's a larger discussion that I can't fit into this video, so let's just go over some basics first. The aim of Buddhism is enlightenment. For the monks, it's a lot of seeing past the material world and the impulses of the mind. But for everyday life, enlightenment means two things: knowing what your impulses and ego want you to do, and doing something else. It's slightly reductive, but for our purposes more than enough. Isshin Yoshimoto is a Japanese businessman who developed a journaling practice not unlike the Stoic audit called Niken. It centers itself around 3 questions that target a relationship in your life. It asks what they gave you, what you gave them, and what problems or inconveniences you have caused them. It doesn't have a set relationship or time frame, because the goal is to generally broaden your horizons of consideration. I mentioned ego earlier, and it's important to note that I don't exclusively mean a sense of cockiness or arrogance. The definition of ego that I'm using is any persistent identity statement that you believe in. I just lost, and I've lost more games than I've won, are observations. I'm a loser is an ego. This definition of ego is largely derived from Ayurvedic ahamkar, which is understood to be a defense mechanism against negative emotions. If you're a loser, then you're not responsible for failing. In fact, if you're a loser, the best thing to do is to bury your head in the sand and ignore any and all risks. We want to avoid the ego being the primary driver of behavior, but there are ways to leverage it. The closest thing in Buddhism to a persistent identity is the mind stream, which is the understanding that all you are is a persistent stream of consciousness. It's the Buddhist answer to the ship of Theseus, as long as the ship you're talking about can think. On an intuitive level, we understand this. Have you heard of the duplicates paradox? It's another name for the teletransporter problem, but it goes like this. Say there's a teleporter, but it works by dismantling you atom by atom and reassembling you somewhere else. Did you actually travel? Or did an identical clone of you pop up with all of your memories? Buddhists would say that you died once you entered the teleporter, and the you that arrives at your destination isn't you at all. It's just a perfect copy. This concept of the mind stream, that there is no persistent self, pairs quite nicely with the idea of avidya, which exists in both Hinduism and Buddhism, and translates to ignorance. Avidya is an ignorance of the nature of self. And while Hinduism and Buddhism interpretations of the self are opposing, avidya is, on a practical level, an ignorance of the true nature of self that causes suffering. Put simply, the idea of the mind stream in avidya is that every day, you wake up a fundamentally different person. Your thoughts are different, your desires are different, and the only persistence is in memory and a stream of consciousness. Some days you want to wake up and play video games, and some days you wake up and you want to study, or grind, or read some philosophy. Dr. K's Why It's So Hard to Be Consistent covers this topic of a video from a Hindu perspective, and the key takeaway from that video is as follows. Every day, you wake up as a different person, and for the next 24 hours, you are the custodian of the next guy's life. Have some compassion for them and do what's best for them, and eventually you'll find yourself on the receiving end of all this effort. All of this pairs quite nicely with the concept of genuine pretending, which is from a more modern interpretation of the Zhuangzi, the Zhuangzhou. The abridged story goes like this. A carpenter apprentice gathers wood with his master and spots an old gnarled tree. It provides shade and has lived a long life. The apprentice asks why they do not cut the tree down, and the master says that the tree is useless. It would be worse material to work with, so it is best to leave it. Of course, to the tree, being useless is what keeps it alive. The other trees and their utility and value to others get cut down in life before they get to live out their journeys. Genuine pretending is the understanding that you can't choose all your roles in life, and therefore it's pointless to identify with them. Be like an actor or a child, committing to the role so long as it aligns with your values, serves you, and doesn't hurt anyone. Sisyphus55 relates this specifically to masculinity and gender when he says, if you wish, dress like a man, talk like a man, walk like a man, but stop when it begins to hurt those around you. I would include yourself in the set of those around you, and expand this perspective to mean any role that you take on. But what does a role mean, and how does it differ from ego? Part 2. Canoes and hats. Any given ego developed to help you cope with a role that you were assigned in life, but they can stick around, and when they do, they tend to carry around limiting beliefs. Struthless likens these limiting beliefs to a canoe that you lug around everywhere in his video called How Self-Belief Can Make or Break You. You can also think of them as hats. The basic idea, though, is that your beliefs about yourself shape your thoughts, which shape your emotions, which shape your actions. To counter the ego's attempts to limit you, use Socratic questioning. Struthless covers this in his video, but essentially you ask whether there's any evidence for this belief, whether you're making any assumptions, and whether this comes from a place of emotion. The point is to build a case for the opposite, to logically dismantle the ego statement so that you can move forward with some clarity. There are ways to leverage egos, of course. The alter ego effect says that by constructing an identity that is already what you want to be and embodying it, you can perform better. Athletes and entertainers are known to build up alter egos when it's time for them to get to work. To build an alter ego, outline desired personality traits, build evidence for the alter ego's success, and associate it with an object. The book itself goes into much more detail about it, but this is just a Cliff Notes version. If you don't feel like becoming Batman, however, you can use the basic practice to build a better ego. Struthless repeatedly brings up a practice in his videos which I like to call the good, the bad, and the audit. First, you define your best self a few years down the line, and you do the same for your worst self. Now, the actual qualities that make up your best and worst are entirely arbitrary and up to you, but at the end of each day, week, or month, log everything of importance that you do as creating one of the two selves. The way he does it is, you have 3 columns, one for the action, the second for the best self, and the third for the worst self, and essentially for each action you either check off the best box or check off the worst box. It's essentially a way of documenting the 2 wolves inside of you and what you're feeding them. I wouldn't recommend doing this with intervals longer than a month, because it gets harder and harder to act on that kind of information. The point of all of this ego work is to move towards an identity that you can actively shape with your actions. James Clear, in Atomic Habits, iterates on this idea by saying that every action you take is a vote for the person that you'll become. Dolly Parton once said to find out who you are and then do it on purpose. What we've covered so far is the doing it on purpose. But to find out who you are, you're going to want to find your values. Discovering your own values is a very long and reflective process, so let's get into the collection of practices that will let you find your way. Part 3. Practices. In most scientific analysis, there are 2 kinds of data, qualitative and quantitative. Qualitative data is anything that can't be expressed through numbers. Quantitative data is anything that can be. There's an internet community built around the idea of the quantified self. By recording data about yourself, you can spot trends that you could try to correct. It's a similar principle to how bodybuilders will track their sets, reps, and weights over time. To quantify your life, you need 3 basic tools: a mood tracker, a time tracker, and a habit tracker. These are easily measured and unbiased sources of information, and a lot of apps can pull double duty. Dailyo, for example, covers the functions of a mood tracker and a habit tracker. My app stack for now is Dailyo for mood and habit tracking and Toggl for time tracking. The counterpoint to the quantified self is the qualified self, which is more in-depth in terms of measurement and subject to biases. For our purposes, to build up a qualified self, I recommend a diary, a deep thinking journal, and a soliloquy journal. A diary is just a recollection of the day and, more importantly, how you felt about it. A deep thinking journal is a collection of your thoughts and, more importantly, your own analysis of your thoughts, arguments for and against, essentially attempting to construct arguments and deconstructions of your own thoughts. Deep thinking is an exercise in metacognition, so there's not really a wrong way to do it. I can only recommend going a handful of layers deep, maybe 3 or 4 in terms of self-analysis before cutting it off there. Soliloquies are dialogues where you essentially talk to yourself or a character in some written format to discuss something that is important or something that requires a lot of nuance and perspective to fully understand. The nice part about journaling to build up a qualified self is that it's modular and materially pretty cheap. You just need something to write with. It can be pen and paper or it can be digital. Either method works just fine. There are strengths and disadvantages to each one. But any structure that is applied to a journaling practice is generally self-imposed and self-adapted, which is hugely beneficial for the process. There's more to talk about, like task management and how exactly to implement these practices, but that's beyond the scope of this video. Further reading for this lecture is Sisyphus 55's In Search of Healthy Masculinity, Dr. K's Why It's So Hard to Be Consistent, Park Notes' How to Journal and Think Like a Philosopher, and Struthless' The Journaling System That Changed My Life. Links in the description. See you next time, class.